feeling a little bit bad about Alan Greenspan because he was so nice to write that about Coolidge. Because I have some gossip to share with you that relates to him, actually. It has to do with something that's in the news. Maybe you're familiar with it. The story starts with Jackson Hole. You've heard of Jackson Hole. Every year, the powerful central bankers go and convene there, right? And they affirm, essentially, the basic principles of our nation's economic policy. One, easier interest rates are key in a crisis and maybe forever after. Oh, it's necessary to stave off downturn. Heaven forbid we have a downturn. Monetary policy is the central policy of American growth, and monetary policy people are better than other people. Right? I'm paraphrasing. Central bankers have the ability, because they're smart, to fine-tune the economy. They know all the metrics. They've graduated first. They had the core CPI and the CPI, and I think I heard President Lockhart talk about a deflator recently, right? Now they move on. They pick the metrics very well for measuring inflation, and they know exactly where unemployment should be. It should be 5.5. And then they can commence with normalization. Normalization, right? But not until then. And then maybe it should be 5.2. It seems like the unemployment measure keeps that goalpost keeps moving, right? And strong financial regulation is really good. Too big to fail is the right particular doctrine, and debt doesn't matter very much, right? Oh, budget deficit doesn't matter that much. So that's the Jackson Hole Conference, late August. Media come from around the world. The Jackson Hole, it's like Bilderberg, Davos, sounds very high. The media people are very important too. And it's all very sort of like a bunch of gods on Olympus, right? Convening, and we all write about it. And the people who are there, they went to where? Princeton, and I respect Princeton, but Princeton and Princeton. Right? And maybe Princeton. But they run the gamut from A to B, as they say in music. There's a lot of difference between the economists who lead our country. They might, once in a while, have someone who went to Harvard, Dr. Feldstein, that's about it. And I say this with affection because some of these people are my teachers, but there's not much dissent there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but President Lockhart doesn't always dissent, right? Maybe he's right. And Americans respect the Fed, that's it. Fed knowledge, why? It intimidates us and it intimidates markets. Markets respond to what the Fed does. The media are part of that. Well, recently, a tiny nonprofit group, barely in existence, announced it too was going to have a conference in Jackson Hole right at the same time as a big Fed, right? It was going to be about monetary policy. Ooh. And at this other meeting, the second group would discuss alternate monetary policies, alternate economic policies for the Fed and Treasury. Maybe talk about the emphasis on monetary policy. Maybe it's overblown. Maybe there are other issues. After all, there's a recent Pew poll that shows that 64% of Americans still think the number one economic issue in the United States is not the interest rate, it is the federal debt, the budget deficit. So maybe they would talk about that at this other economic conference at Jackson Hole. It wasn't exactly planned to be, the group that's doing it is called American Principles, a non-establishment group, the second group. You think, oh my gosh, it wasn't quite a Tea Party group, although I think the Tea Party would be welcomed. It's actually, one of the people involved was a professor from Princeton. And they invited former Fed Chairman Greenspan to speak, and that was a big deal. And Charlie Calamiris, you may know him from American Enterprise Institute and so on. But anyhow, just as it was all getting planned, the big conference and the fringe conference in Jackson Hole, a blog post appears in the New York Times, really mean blog post, and says, "Mr. Greenspan is the worst ex-Fed president ever." Ooh, right? That's pretty mean, right? Wait a minute, the worst ex-Fed president ever. How many of you saw that? Not too many, right? Just a few, right? Some, though. And the next thing you know, Chairman Greenspan is not going to Jackson Hole. And I know your speaker committee has these challenges, but it turns out he's not going. Maybe he has another commitment. He's not going, but anyway. And then some of the other parties at the little outside fringe conference are also saying, well, maybe they don't have enough time to go to the second fringe conference at Jackson Hole. And there's a little bit of a challenge there for that conference. So what happened? First of all, it's pretty extreme for one economist, Fed person, to call another economist, especially a former Fed chair, the worst. That's right? That's an effort at intimidation. It's also pretty extreme, but I know he would have a reason that Chairman Greenspan pulled out. Maybe he's sick, and so on. I think, first of all, it shows the price of showing disrespect to the economic guild is very high. If you diss your colleagues, that's not good. There's a lot of loyalty in the Fed, and some of that can be good. But what strikes us also about this story is that it reflects concern, desperation even. What's the problem? What are the central bankers afraid of about this little bitty conference? The consensus group, the central bankers who are going to the big Jackson Hole, fear that the consensus might be challenged and that challenge might get some attention from all those media people. And even more importantly, and you know it and I know it, what does the Fed fear? It fears that it itself might be wrong, right? They could be disproven. Well, if interest rates go up fast, they would be disproven, right? If inflation goes up fast, especially, they would be disproven. If the new system of regulation turns out to render firms more fragile rather than less, that would be a disproof for the financial regulation side. If there's a big downturn, they could be disproven. If it turns out asset prices matter more than CPI, they could be disproven that concern. Well, history suggests, and that's what I'll talk about tonight, that such concern is warranted. So what I'm going to do now is sketch out for you 3 moments in history where, like now, as now, economic policy was important. People were wondering, and in each of those cases, the consensus about what to do was as strong as it is today. QE forever is what it is today. And in each case, the consensus turned out to be, let's just say, not quite right. I'm going to be general, to be wrong, even stunningly so. This is a good story, but as I tell it, you want to think about what one might do in the same situation and what a consensus reveals. Sometimes a consensus will obscure opportunity. Consensus didn't tell us about that energy would do so well and that the U.S. would, surpass Russia in energy production, as we read today. Your colleague and new president, Steve Davenport, said something to me which stuck with me. He said, if we're all in the same boat, if we all are in the consensus, that itself is a problem. Maybe you should be in another boat if everyone's in the same boat, right? All this takes a moment to convey. And so I'm grateful to Mr. Davenport, who I got to know on the phone, Kathy Ford, who I got to know on the phone, President Chen, and you, the Atlanta Society, for this time tonight. Okay, my first story that springs to mind, and I picked stories that are kind of old so that we don't say, oh, that's because it was Democrats or Republicans or and anything like that. Was nearly 100 years ago after World War I. The late teens and the early 20s. That period features some significant corollaries, parallels. You'll recognize things to today. First of all, the country had just been through a crisis. Our crisis was the financial crisis. Their crisis was World War I. There was a lot of confusion in World War I. As you probably know, the railroad, which was much more important than it is now, was nationalized, and then it was denationalized. We went off the gold standard, then we went back on the gold standard, like that. There was disruption and what we call uncertainty. And the recovery that came after proved uneven. One sector did pretty well. What was that? Energy. And the rest didn't seem to do so well, and prices were disconcertingly high. And what was the consensus response to this? What should we do given this uneven recovery and uncertainty. Well, the first consensus was tariffs are the answer. Gotta be tariffs. That will help Americans feel confident again. They can produce goods and not wage revolution, and nope, we're tired of Europe and it doesn't matter, let's do tariffs on imports. You would have to look long and hard to find a Republican who wasn't for tariffs. In fact, Calvin Coolidge, my subject, actually came to Atlanta to campaign for tariffs when he was vice president, and Atlanta told him what was wrong with his philosophy. But he didn't really listen, and they went away a little miffed. You can see it in the papers. It was in 1921, I think. And I want to tell you something else that miffed him. He left his overcoat at the YMCA. It had a nice lining. Anyway, that was the first thing. Tariffs, that's got to be it. And I think it showed a little bit of, not a Coolidge word, but a little bit of chutzpah for Coolidge to lecture you all on tariffs, but there he did. In that way, he was part of the consensus. The second economic consensus of that period was government needed to expand. Coolidge was not part of that, but President Wilson was. President Wilson said, I'll read it to you because it's amazing. I am perfectly sure, sounds like Janet Yellen, I am perfectly sure that the state has got to control everything and that everybody needs and uses. I am perfectly sure the state has got to control everything that everybody needs and uses. Wow. And international opinion was backing that consensus up. You know, Keynes was not yet Keynes, but he was still already commenting. My friend Jim Grant pointed this out to me, and he said, an individualist society left to itself does not work well, or even tolerably. And the more troublous the times, the worse does a laissez-faire system work. And that sounds a lot like Fed policy. But that was the general attitude in the early 20s. They wanted to change the policy on wages. They had a new idea, and it was consensus. You've got to push wages up. If you push, they learned that from Henry Ford. Worker makes money, extra money, he'll buy back the car, spend it, right? He'll buy back the car. And this was supposed to become official government policy. The money would be this was a new word at the time, stimulus. So I know what you're thinking. These are all Democrats. Again, they weren't. Some were Republicans, but that was the consensus. There were many, the Republicans at that time were the Progressive Party, and they were for, making trolleys public, that is part of the government. Trolleys were important then. We're making power and water public, as you know from the own history of the Southern Company and so on, which was tangled up in this. Last item, there was no inflation. They didn't think there was inflation. Prices were high because greedy middlemen were raising them. And they needed to be stopped. And they needed to be you needed to scold the market for staples down. Learned about staples from one fellow tonight, right? So the politicians would come out and scold the market. You go down, drop your price now. Go down, down, down. And the funny thing, the prices did not respond. I think that was probably they didn't want to raise interest rates, and you know why. But anyway, the consensus did it. But what's interesting is along came, by accident, two small outside groups, almost like that outside group at Jackson Hole, who thought differently. One was actual bankers, just like you, including a banker who became head of the Fed named W.P.G. Harding. He was not related to President Harding. His name was W.P.G. Harding, and he'd actually worked in a bank before he became a central banker. That's important, right? And he thought we had to raise interest rates because he thought that might be inflation, not greedy merchants that were making the prices go up 40% and so on, and he did. And the second party group that came in that was not in the consensus were the narrow Republican group, who were more conservative. The man who became President Harding, he was elected Warren Harding, and his faithful Vice President Calvin Coolidge. And they thought the government shouldn't be bigger, it should be smaller. And they actually continued to pull the government back. It had already started a bit, because of the war. They just kept it going long after the progressives wanted cutting. So all these things are happening. Well, you want to hear the recipe? The economy's in trouble. We raise interest rates 300 basis points. We double interest rates. That's real good when the economy's in trouble. We're going to do that. And the economy's in trouble. We're going to cut the government in half. Cut fiscal in half. Wow, that's what they did. That's quite a recipe, right? It was not what the consensus said, really, the consensus of a few years before. The results were quite dramatic. And at first, the other view seemed to be borne out because we were plunged into a depression, right? And unemployment of 15% maybe in some cities. Harry Truman lost his haberdasher's shop. It was dark. But the thing about the depression caused by the huge interest rate hike and the cutback in government was it was real short. It was 18 months and then it was over. And then all of a sudden things were good. And 18 months out, the Wall Street Journal is writing, from practically all angles, 1922 can be recorded as the renaissance of prosperity. Well, we don't even remember this downturn. My friend Jim Grant just won the Hayek Prize. He called his book about this downturn The Forgotten Depression, because it was so short. Maybe that's good, right? That's kind of interesting. I mean, what makes a depression in American memory is the duration. Instead of 18 months, the Big Depression was 120 months, right? So maybe that policy recipe of raising interest rates when you suspect monetary overhang or inflation is a good policy sometimes, right? When things are kind of squishy, the way they are now, we're sure prices aren't quite reflecting what you think they ought to reflect. There was what we say price discovery in that downturn. Well, that's an interesting recipe. Maybe we should study that in our children's high school books along with the other recipes they study. So that's the first one, right? The second one is 29. There was a strong consensus then that many of the reformers who had not got power in 21 had power now, and they really wanted to push wages up, do the Henry Ford formula, and they did. Starting with Herbert Hoover. This is a bipartisan story. They also wanted tariffs to protect America, and as you know, Smoot-Hawley was passed in this period. I'm sure some of you have seen Ben Stein on Ferris Bueller's Day Off give his lecture on Smoot-Hawley. And the big difference that's worth pointing out was the view on inflation, which had shifted. This time, everyone saw inflation everywhere. So the man who would become President, Roosevelt, says Hoover is participating and leading an inflation orgy. A Democrat says that about a Republican. Oh, interesting. Okay, and that sounds like Paul Krugman, inflation orgy. That's a little mean. Anyway, they're both battling each other to be the better inflation hawk. Well, as you know, about 1929, they didn't really have that much inflation. Actually, they kind of had deflation, and it got worse, right? So they were wrong on that, and one of the interesting things I've discovered relates to the labor price. They significantly pushed up the labor price on this theory that it would be a stimulus. Well, the labor price does a lot to explain why unemployment was so high. That makes common sense. Oh, gee, I have to pay more than I can afford to hire people or rehire them, so I'll hire fewer, or I won't rehire so fast. And the epic, legendary unemployment of the 1930s is better explained when you know how high they drove up the labor price. They drove it above trend, so if you see a chart for a whole century, you'll see the labor price in real terms way above where it should be in the 1930s. That is perverse, to make labor expensive in a downturn, but that is what the policy was. It was even stronger. The labor price was even higher than they knew because they thought they were in inflation, but they were in deflation, and you know what deflation does to prices, right? The workers were more expensive than the companies expected because of deflation. So the dollar was worth more. John L. Lewis, the great labor leader, didn't even know what he had wrought because he didn't know whether they were in inflation or deflation. Monetary ignorance. I would say ignorance is too negative, because monetary lack of knowledge, monetary mystery again. And all this is happening, and it was very different from the stories we all learned. Where I learned about the labor price, and that's newer work, was from a professor I recommend to you. I hope he gets to work at the Fed, named Lee Ohanian at UCLA. And that's newer work, but it's quite significant. The final period I'm going to mention is much closer, and some of you in the room will recall it, and that was the 70s. And that was when the authorities insisted, as they had after World War I, that inflation might be less than it really was, or that it could be controlled, more importantly. They also insisted, avoiding the monetary, that maybe through other measures we could control money. You remember Gerald Ford had whip inflation now. That recalls the 1920s. We're gonna scold inflation down. Just by sheer disapproval. It didn't seem to work, right? And the inflation was much greater than we expected, and it was much harder than we expected to control it. And even today, when Chairman Volcker walks around, he's very tired, remembering how angry the manufacturers were when he raised the interest rates and forced a great recession upon our country. Sort of a textbook for you metrics people, a real textbook era of the 70s was the deification of the so-called Phillips curve, which the Phillips curve says, you know this, some of you, but there's a trade-off. You can pick your poison. You can either take unemployment or inflation. You have to take one or the other. Well, as you know, they had both unemployment and inflation in the 1970s. So the Phillips curve wasn't operating in that decade, and there was even a term that was the rebuttal to the Phillips curve hypothesis, which is stagflation, right? Stagnating economy with inflation, low unemployment. These stories are useful ones. I like picking them because we don't really know the people who promulgated the policy, and they were in both parties. It wasn't a party political battle, really. There were errors enough to go around. And the trouble was not one of party, it was of guild, especially economic guild. Everyone gets together and talks about what they learned in graduate school, and then policy comes from that. I'm telling you this also negative, but you want to remember there are always surprises that make what these groups do look even sillier. Our surprise recently has been energy, right? Nobody expected at the Fed, especially energy, to revive the American economy, but it did. So the Fed is running after, trying to capture that. And there were surprises in those periods. The progressives of the teens never expected the automobile to lift up and take away the U.S. economy, and so it would drive down the road very fast in the 1920s. But the auto did. They never expected the reviving power of electricity. So routinely, innovation makes fools of regulators, right? Including monetary authorities. What do they, I feel I've been a little mean, but what do all these stories tell us about now? One is, when you look, what happened to Europe when we passed all those tariffs? Well, they lost money, true, but what else happened? They were very fragile democracies, and they thought we didn't care, and they went over to fascism. Just go read what Hjalmar Schacht wrote in his, in his writings about what happened when we turned away from Germany. The world paid the political cost of our silly, destructive tariff policy in the 20s, because countries that could have gone good went bad. One policy point would be Latin America now in trade, even if you don't like TPA for what the authority gives the executive. You always want to ask, what does Latin America need? And what can we do to stabilize that region? I think those two are corollaries. Lower taxes and small government gave us an incredibly strong economy in the 1920s. Don't let anyone tell you it was a joke like Great Gatsby. The patent rate was through the roof. We would be so lucky if we had an economy like the 1920s economy, where people got new things such as electricity, automobiles, radios, and looked to the future with bright eyes. But there's the more general point, which I started with: beware consensus. Beware the guild. You might admire them, you might be part of it, but beware that, because the strength of a consensus does not correlate to its accuracy. You might be clever and even suggest there's an inverse correlation. The bossier the consensus people, the more fearful the Fed is that they'll have some little other conference at Jackson Hole. Well, that tells you something, right? That maybe they really do think their ideas might not be quite right. In addition, the past tells us of a lack of diversity. And I'm talking here about diversity of economic thought and education. If we all go to the same schools, we're all trained too similarly. Whether, whatever you feel about certain institutions. That flaw is certainly evident in the struggle over the Fed structure. One of the redeeming features of the Fed structure is that we do have these regional Fed presidents. The law doesn't always work, but often in the past, regional Fed presidents have been more independent and dared to say things that the guys in Washington wouldn't dare to say, because they were chosen in part by people like you in their communities. That's precious, and whenever there's legislation about that, it's precious that we stay in whatever remnant of independence those regional feds have. Another point that seems quite important to me is the problem with metrics. Back in 1921, the first example I gave to you, Friday morning at 8:30 meant nothing. Right? It was just Friday morning at 8:30 or 9 o'clock. That's because they didn't really have big data on unemployment yet. The union kept data, the states kept data, but there was no big government number, and therefore the rotten unemployment that resulted from the sharp recession, from the high interest rates, wasn't really covered by the newspaper. And it would have been, except it disappeared so fast, right? This scrutiny of certain data by the media make it harder to take necessary steps sometimes. The data that we're all looking at is the CPI or the core CPI or jobs. You may ask yourself, well, what is a job now? Maybe we are quantifying what a job is wrong. Maybe the job isn't the same thing it was before. In the 1920s, they didn't even say the economy. The word economy meant was savings. I have household economy, I save. They said commerce. Maybe that's a better word for us to use and a better measure. They didn't say money supply, they said credit. Well, you're familiar with credit. Maybe it's a better measure of what's going on. I talked today to Mr. Shilkett, where are you? About his metric, Staples. Maybe that metric is a better metric. There are many, many other metrics that should come into the discussion. And we all know, everyone in this room, that that if there is a metric that will tell us about the future of the economy, it's probably not the stress test. Right? The fact is that the stress test may weaken the economy because it provides a kind of false comfort of control. We pretend we can control big companies. And what did it say in the Wall Street Journal? Guide them to failure. Let's try and visualize that. Guide them. But it's so far from creative destruction, which is the concept you might want to bring in. I'm going to close, but I will say one reason I was particularly excited to talk to Mr. Davenport and to hear and get this invitation is because this group, you're leaders, and you do have the power to broaden the discussion. The media, you watch them on television, they seem all powerful, those people in New York. The media are sheep. I'm here because I'm one of them. I can tell you that. They are sheep. And it's up to you to inform them. You're the educators. They can learn. They all follow each other, but they can learn. They're intelligent sheep. So don't be intimidated by them in the same way. Don't be intimidated by the Fed. You know as much as the Fed does. You know, and you certainly know as much as the media people do. Two indices that I've been loving and following as they get started is Professor Davis at the University of Chicago has an uncertainty index he's developing that looks at the cause, what happens to markets in political uncertainty. It's not just volatility uncertainty, markets, market affecting market, it's political uncertainty, and surprise, he finds a correlation between political uncertainty and market trouble. Another one also out of Chicago is the Financial Trust Index, introduced by Paola Sapienza at Northwestern in partnership with Luigi Gonzalez. And they try and look more on the supply side, that would be your side, of banking, and ask, what does the supply side think about how the economy is going, in addition to the customer, the demand side. It's not only optional, it's not optional that you stand up. It's kind of crucial. There's a lot of good news that's not being heard either, and you can lead on that. Everyone in this room has his own views or her own views about what policy can be, but where we do agree is that, let's put it this way, what we do agree on is that for there to be no disagreement has got to be wrong. You know, it was always a blessing that the regional Fed presidents were picked the way they were, which is partly from the community, and I understand some legislation has watered that down, right, lately, and you just don't want it to go any farther. What happens, it's not that, it's just everyone, I mean, you know this phenomenon also on the Supreme Court. How many non-Harvard, non-Yale, non-Stanford maybe, Supreme Court justices are there? How many? Zero, right? Well, so why is that? Is it because they mean to shut everyone out? Not quite. It's because they're comfortable with each other, and you've all sat on juries or reviewed, credit applications, and and someone comes before you and wants something, and maybe two people come, and one of them has better credentials, and it's easier to take the one with the better credentials. So now nobody says, are those credentials really better, or they just sound cool, right? So many a time on a jury I have fought for George Mason University, and usually it gets beaten by Princeton, although George Mason is the most interesting school in America today when it comes to economics, because they're doing what's called public choice theory, and I hope we all send our kids there to learn. So it's just a kind of snobbery, but mostly laziness of what happens, and they all work together. And I say this with great affection for some of these people, but they all work together. So you work with the people you work with. You do that in your field too, and well, who else, that outsider? It's just like that. And where in the Fed process is the 64% of the American people who are number one concerned about the budget deficit and not about the interest rate? It's a big problem, but it's not. It can be corrected. I think again the media reinforce it out of respect and laziness. Yeah. Well, you could tell from my talk that one, I'm not a monetary scholar, but I think long rates are really important because they're important around the world, and short rates can be important too because they're a market, right? They can the Fed control it? Not totally, not really, no, right? When you have taper tantrums and then reaction, it seems like there's a control. Not really, no. Which is why we should have a much more empirical measure of what the Fed should do. Specifically for Fed reform, what I would do would be strengthen the regional Feds and the way that their leaders are chosen, more from the community trust, and end the dual mandate. Currently the Fed has two obligations. One is economic growth and the other is monetary stability. I would get rid of the economic growth. So that's where I would put my emphasis. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I mean, a lot of Keynesianism is just window dressing for political activity, right? Europe doesn't want to give up on social democracy. They're used to it now, even though they don't really need it as much. So ergo, they have the monetary policy they have, with a few caveats from the Germans now fading, because the Germans no longer remember the hyperinflation. So that's how it's said. But even domestically, it's very, very hard to see what economic theory means when you just look at it economically. It's almost all explainable politically. Demand is voters. Therefore, demand is interesting. Right? Supply is just a few guys, less interesting, not that many votes, although they might give a donation. Well, I'm married to a gold person. So I would just say let's have a less discretionary currency. I am sure something will compete with the dollar very soon, some combination of Bitcoin and a commodity and a government. So if we were having this discussion in the 70s, it would have been very hard to imagine just because of the technology how you would make a deep currency. What were you going to say?
Is the Fed actively involved in that discussion, do you think?
No, it's just sort of, you remember the story about Larry Summers and Facebook? Did you follow that story from the movie? It's true. These boys come and say, these other boys took our ideas. And he's like, it's just some social network thing, right? It's just the undergrad, what they call the pig book, the undergraduate picture book of all the undergraduates. Get out of my room. I'm the president of Harvard University and the former Treasury Secretary. And I do think Larry Summers knew that Facebook would be worth billions, at least on paper, billions of dollars very soon. So it's like that. Stuff happens that you didn't expect. And I don't see why it couldn't happen with money, but the Fed doesn't have that in its culture, the Washington Fed. Well, that's a fabulous question, because you sort of have, on the one hand, I don't know, Jon Stewart or Colbert, right, yelling from the progressive left, or Rachel, right? And on the other hand, you have Fox, which yells back, right? They yell at each other. One of the, you're sitting here wondering, why is Amity doing a foundation? Well, the reason is Coolidge was incredibly civil, and he loved debate. And so what we do at the foundation is we take all varsity debaters from high school and we train them in econ to debate both sides, or maybe a third side, right? 3 sides, maybe there are 5 sides, right? To economics, so that they will be comfortable with the possibility that something else is true, and they won't be like Mario Draghi. They're all arrogant, and I find that God's work. Not to be too light with it, because every smart 17-year-old who thinks about economics is one person who's going to remember it later when he watches the commercials and when he gets in politics. And maybe he won't have that awful problem of going from high school to Georgetown Graduate School, into monetary business without ever learning about econ, which often happens, or any other school, So I love anybody who trains high schoolers and gives them the opportunity to think for themselves and debate. And since Coolidge did, I hope you all come and visit us at Plymouth Notch, where he's from in Vermont, and judge these kids when they debate, because they learn everything and they remember everything. There's an aversion to the documentary in conservative television too. I would really love to see Roger Ailes, the head of Fox, do a documentary on what is a hedge fund. Because a hedge fund might have some good things. Maybe, it's less regulated. Maybe that's why they're so popular. Whatever. Or what is money? And they have in their offices men with ties who are waiting around, who've made wonderful documentaries before to do these documentaries, but they don't seem to happen. You just see a lot of screaming on Fox. And I like Fox, but where's the documentaries for the more free market or conservative side? Because the other side has long documentaries, right? But they're tilted. So I don't know the answer to that, but I would say that it's important to bring it up every time with anyone you meet who's in the media, and kind of shame them into it. What, you're only going to have people who scream and say perception is reality and stuff on television? You know better than that. And sometimes if you call them on it, they stand up. Roger Ailes is a very intelligent man, and he's interested in these topics. I think he just thinks that no one will watch a documentary, but they would. They would. So maybe there's someone in this room who can start the TV station that the lady suggested, and we're all going to hope we can appear on it. No, seriously, because right now that's possible, and it's very much needed. We were thinking of having the kids debate and have a reality show with kids debating, and that would be the way to do it, right? Because the kids are just as good as 25-year-olds when they debate monetary. There was another question? When there's value, the money goes to it. So it will tell you The money will go to the place where something is real as opposed to something is just made up. And you just watch it go. I mean, when you watch the money go to India, for example, versus China for a while, India's not perfect, but you follow, I would say, people chase returns, but they also chase quality, right? So I'm not so, I think it will end, maybe not pretty, but it will end. And everyone will go around and say, we all knew that the yen Bitcoin gold was the answer, the yen Bitcoin energy, as if, and you can't tell them I told you so, because you can never tell anyone I told you so. Oh, I don't know, enough about it, but you do know the IMF's record in the past is a bit like the Fed's record. Very interesting, intelligent people, sometimes good result, often crazy result. So we'll just leave it at that. I'm not sure the Greek people, why are all these countries social democracies? Because those people are left-wing? No, it's not the only reason. We made them social democracies because we wanted them to be stable in the Cold War. The other side was communism. They were going to be attracted to communism, so let's just have a little social democracy. We'll give them nice health insurance, and then they won't go communist. That was actually the thinking. So now we're dealing with the legacy of that. Everyone's been trained in social democracy, I guess that's my way of saying this is a political problem too. What the Europeans expect, they expect to be safe. Not just Greece, so you can never be safe. What they have over us is they expect to die. We don't expect to die, right? If we have health insurance, we're never going to die. The doctors are going to fix that. So they have that advantage over us. They understand that they may one day die and that science cannot prevent that. Well, I'm working on Coolidge. I think he's a great hero, and sometimes we all have ideas. It's a really cerebral room right here. But most people think about ideas through people, right? So Coolidge is a good hero. He cut taxes and held the government back, and he was always polite. But another thing I'm doing is I'm writing a book called The Silent Majority, which treats the Great Society. It doesn't treat the 60s broadly. There have been a lot of 60s books. Oh, the 60s, it was such a collage. We can't even remember it, right? I'm specifically looking at Great Society. And Great Society is like the New Deal. It promised a lot. It sounded good. Everyone meant well. Some of its achievements were important. I think the civil rights achievements were important. But the entitlement part of it and the groupthink part of it were quite destructive. And that's where we have our Greek situation. So I'll just tell you, the superhero of Silent Majority is Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And the devil, the joker of, because I do think in cartoons of Silent Majority, is McNamara, because he was such a planner. But I'm willing and eager to hear from you about other characters we should emphasize in the Silent Majority, because I'm working on it with all my students this fall. And this is a print book. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie.